get comments like these on my videos sometimes, but what does the science actually say? I'm Sasha, and my dog Parker has been using augmentative interspecies communication, or AIC, also known as the talking buttons, for over 4 years now. And today, I'm going to break down what the research actually says about dogs and those talking buttons. While scientific research on animals' comprehension of human language isn't new, the research on this specific mode of communication, AIC, is. It is only in the last 5 to 7 years or so that scientists have actually started studying this potential form of communication. In 2018, Christina Hunger, a speech-language pathologist, decided to adapt the AAC After her success gained some publicity, others started trying it with their own pets at home. The confluence of the pandemic, leaving a lot of people at home, and social media, especially the increased popularity of the Clock app, allowed for people across the globe to become aware of the possibility of communicating with their own pets this way through accounts like What About Bunny? Uniquely, unlike most animal studies that take place in a lab, the fact that so many people had these devices in their homes meant that researchers could study these animals in spaces they were already comfortable in and familiar with, a much more quote-unquote natural environment for the subjects. While there are certainly other factors that can complicate things in not being in a controlled lab setting, researchers have sought ways around this depending on the study. The first study that came out was published in Interaction Studies in November of 2023. The article, titled Soundboard Using Pets, Introducing a New Global Citizen Science Approach to Interspecies Communication, and written by Drs. Amalia Bastos and Federico Rossano, does exactly that. It lays out the methodology of the research, meaning that it lays out how the scientists are collecting and analyzing the data and steps they're taking to avoid potential issues. The paper traces previous animal communication studies, largely done with primates, and lays out the rightful reasons these have been critiqued on both scientific and ethical grounds. Scientists should not raise chimps as if they're their own children. One of the main critiques they bring up is that previous studies typically focus on one animal, usually an ape or a chimp, at a time. Therefore, any resulting science was difficult to generalize. Having thousands of participants across the globe using AIC devices allows for broader conclusions to be drawn about interspecies communication between pets and their humans. They also bring up the potential for the clever Hans effect, excuse me while I eye roll, I am so sick of hearing about this, which refers to humans intentionally or not cueing their animals. We'll talk more about how the researchers managed this specifically in some of the later studies. But I think it's important to note that they were very aware of this as a potential issue from the start, and so we're keeping that in mind when building experiments and analyzing data. The researchers also note that while the use of apes and chimps involved bringing these animals into artificial settings, dogs and cats, as well as other domesticated animals, have already evolved to live in a human world and interact with them on a regular basis. They have adapted to respond to our communication and have evolved to better communicate with us, developing what we call puppy dog eyes because of the response, us taking care of them, it produces in humans. The rest of the paper outlines the number of dogs and cats in the study, how many buttons they have on average, and the research questions they're interested in investigating. They also base their approach on parallel studies done with young children, justifying their approach. Additionally, they return to this clever Hans critique by noting that one phase of the research includes continuous camera footage in homes so that they are able to have access to unedited presses, allowing them to determine potential cueing. Overall, this is the sort of paper that you want to read if you want to have an understanding of the potential limitations of animal communication studies and how these researchers are addressing that. Or if you're interested in the nitty-gritty of how researchers approach this science. Okay, let's get to the actual meat. That set up the conditions for the study. What conclusions have actually come out of it? A second paper, How Do Soundboard-Trained Dogs Respond to Human Button Presses? An Investigation into Word Comprehension by Bastos et al., looked at whether dogs understand the words on their boards. Specifically, it studied whether dogs would recognize and respond appropriately to food-related, play-related, and outside-related words on their soundboards. They also looked at whether the dog's responses depended on who pressed the button, their human or a stranger, or whether the word was pressed or spoken. They found that regardless of whether the word was spoken or produced by a button, and no matter who was the one who pressed or spoke, that dogs responded appropriately to both play-related and outside-related words. Based on this, they conclude that it is possible to have dogs learn how to use the buttons and understand the connection between the pressing of the button and a real-world consequence. Okay, but how did this study actually work? 2 researchers came to participants' homes. One entered and got everything set up while the other waited outside so that they wouldn't know which buttons were where on the board. After the dog was placed outside of the room with the soundboard, 3 colored stickers, which were randomly assigned, were placed over 3 buttons. 1 related to food, 1 related to outside, and 1 related to play. The colored dots prevented the researcher that hadn't yet entered the room from knowing which button was associated with which word in advance. The human participant then recorded a new button for a nonsense word. In this case, they used a word daxing, and placed that on the soundboard with a colored dot on it as well. The human was then shown a behavior, putting their hands on their head and spinning in a slow circle, that they would have to perform later in the study. During the study, the human participant wore noise-canceling headphones and an eye mask so that they couldn't hear the buttons being pressed. The researcher who started outside also wore noise-canceling headphones. The researcher who had set things up was in the other room, watching everything over a monitor. At the start of each trial, the researcher in the soundboard room would hear which color button to press, triggered by the observing researcher, press it, stare at the dog for a minute, and then turn and face the wall and close their eyes. Then the human participant would get a message in their headphones telling them what action to perform. It was always the action related to the button that had been pressed, and for daxing, it was that new behavior of spinning with your hands on your head. There was an additional set of participants who completed this study on their own, so the researchers weren't in their house, but they were given instructions on how to do it, and then recorded and went back to the researchers. So what were the results? The results showed that dogs exhibited 7 times more play-directed and outside-directed behaviors when those buttons were pressed, with no conclusive evidence on the food-related button. They also found no effect whether the word came from the human or the button, or which human it came from. They also found no difference in the results from those participants who had the researchers come into their homes versus the ones who had done it with instructions over a video, and who had completed the study independently, which is really cool because it means that, individuals doing their studies in their own homes with directions from the researchers are kind of getting the same results as when the researchers are coming to visit, which is great for citizen science. So, what can we conclude from this? Dogs can be taught to use soundboards by non-scientists. They can have contextually appropriate understanding of words on their boards, and global citizen studies can be as effective and produce as reliable results as the ones where researchers are in the home. Phew. Okay, so that lays down the first important steps. What about the next study? A second study was published by Bastos et al. This, so far, is all coming out of the Comparative Cognition Lab at UCSD, so that's why you're seeing a lot of the same names. This article was published in Scientific Reports called Soundboard-Trained Dogs Produce Non-Accidental, Non-Random, and Non-Imitative 2-Button Combinations. Don't you love scientific titles? Very direct. This study pushed the previous study, which was about dogs comprehending presses, to look at the presses that were initiated by the dogs themselves. They were interested to see whether the presses were non-accidental, non-random, and not simply repetitions of what their owners were pressing on the boards. Based on the data, they concluded that dogs' presses cannot be explained by random pressing, and that certain 2-button presses appear at the population level more frequently than can be explained by just chance. Owner presses also don't predict dog presses, showing that they are not merely repeating their humans' presses, suggesting that their use of the buttons is deliberate. Okay, so how did they test this? They pulled from owner-reported data of soundboard presses over 21 months. Sidebar, this is why I love the Fluent Pet app so much with the Connect. I was logging Parker's presses before then, and now they auto-log, and it just saves so much time, and I know that data is going straight to science because I have given permission for the scientists to have access to that data. In analyzing the data, they found only a minimal association between buttons pressed by the dog and their human, showing that they are not simply mimicking human presses. In analyzing the multi-press data, they found certain combinations were more likely than others to appear across the population, indicating that these were not random but intentional and deliberate. So those are the two major studies that have been published so far, plus this kind of contextualizing study about the history and differences between this research into animal communication. There are more coming, and I will create update videos kind of breaking down the research when more papers get published. But I also do want to mention a European conference paper that was presented in 2024 by Maria Verstraete, and I am sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of her name, and I'm so sorry. But this was based on interviews that she did with 21 humans with dogs, some who were using AIC and some who did not, who lived in the US and in Belgium. And she wanted to know whether dogs had agency, according to their owners, if they saw displays of that, and whether AIC helped to facilitate a dog's agency. Through her interviews, she found both that dogs do display agency and that AIC did have the potential to give dogs an ability to exercise their agency and kind of speak up more to improve their quality of life. So that's just a really cool example of, how the buttons can potentially, have an effect on quality of life for a lot of the learners. So interesting to see if that can be kind of more quantitatively studied in the future. There are two final studies that I want to mention that have been presented as contradicting the research that I've just presented, but that if you actually look at what's being studied, don't actually do that. The first is Talking Dogs, the Paradoxes Inherent in the Cultural Phenomenon of Soundboard Use by Dogs by Włodarczyk. Again, I'm definitely butchering that name. I am so sorry. Et al., published in Animals in 2024. It presents a number of potential issues with the presentation of AIC using dogs on social media. It ignores the fact that what is presented on social media is not the same as the data that the researchers who are studying this are looking at. They ignore the fact that interpretation is needed for all communication. Have you ever spent time with a parent and their toddler and not known a thing the kid was saying, but the parent knows exactly what they're talking about? They also suggest the potential risk of AIC replacing other forms of canine-human communication. A fair concern, but one that any engagement with the AIC community would show is the opposite of what those who advocate for it teach, and in fact, that only through understanding body language can presses be understood. The concerns that are addressed in the paper are presented as a sort of gotcha moment, when in reality they are things already addressed in the research that is being produced. They rely on an analysis of social media as data as if that's what's being studied when it's not, and demonstrate a complete disengagement from the community that actually uses the buttons. It's a hot take on social media, and frankly, I think it's wild that this is a scholarly paper, in my opinion. The second paper is from 2025 by Higaki et al. And is called Sound Quality Impacts Dogs' Ability to Recognize and Respond to Playback Words. This is presented as being evidence that dogs can't reliably understand the words coming out of the buttons, something countered in Bastos et al. From 2024, if you remember. But if you look at the details of the study, what it shows is actually something completely different. Unlike the Bastos study, this study did not use dogs who were in households already using soundboards. Rather, these were dogs who were trained to respond to a series of cues from their owner. The study then looked at how well dogs, first regular dogs, and then gifted word learner dogs, or GWLs, and how they responded to cues when they were spoken by their human, by an AIC button, and by an external speaker. They found that the quality of the voice command, human versus AIC button or speaker, impacted the ability of the regular dogs to respond, with their worst ability to respond to the cue coming from the AIC speaker and the highest being vocal speaking. The conclusion the researchers make from this is that dogs don't recognize words when they hear them from the device. This to me is an example of going from A to B to F somehow. First of all, these are not dogs that are familiar with the buttons. While some dogs start using the buttons right away and seem to recognize the meaning of words immediately, I'm looking at you, Parker, others have the words modeled on the buttons for them for days, weeks, or even months before they pick it up. Secondly, this is not how the buttons are used. This was used for commands for the dog. The buttons are used for the dogs to be able to make their own statements, their own communication, for their own voices. This is honestly likely more motivating for them. It seems like a more appropriate conclusion to make from this study would be that dogs unfamiliar with AIC buttons are unlikely to respond to commands from an AIC board. Again, looking at the Bastos study I mentioned earlier, which tested the recognition of words by the buttons only from dogs who are accustomed to the buttons, you get a significant indication of the recognition of the words. So this is a great example of context and methodology mattering. So that's where we are with the research now. Like I said, there is more research forthcoming, and I will be sure to update when that comes out. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more research.